The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time. 23 years of faithful service to the crown had taught him that every detail mattered, every button polished to perfection, every movement calculated and precise. Today felt different, though, heavy with an unspoken tension that seemed to seep through the ancient stone walls. James had joined the Queen's Guard at 19, fresh-faced and eager to serve. His father had been a guardsman before him, and his grandfather before that. The Mitchell family had protected British royalty for 3 generations, a legacy built on unwavering loyalty and absolute devotion to duty. The red uniform wasn't just clothing to James, it was his identity, his purpose, his very soul wrapped in wool and tradition. The news of Queen Elizabeth's passing had shattered something fundamental in James's world. For over 2 decades, he had stood at attention during her public appearances, watched her gentle smile as she greeted dignitaries, witnessed her quiet strength during times of national crisis. She wasn't just his sovereign, she was the steady heartbeat of everything he believed in. When she died, a piece of James died with her. Now, King Charles III sat on the throne, and with him came changes that made James's stomach churn with unease. The most significant change was Camilla, now Queen Consort, a woman whose very presence seemed to mock everything James held sacred about the monarchy. He had watched from his post as she gradually inserted herself into royal life, transforming from the other woman who destroyed a fairy tale marriage into the queen who now demanded the same respect once given to Diana. James remembered Princess Diana vividly. He had been a young guardsman when she walked the halls of the palace, her genuine warmth touching everyone she met. She would stop to chat with the staff, ask about their families, remember their names. Diana had possessed a natural grace that needed no protocol to enforce respect. It flowed from her like sunlight. The people loved her not because they had to, but because she gave them every reason to do so. Camilla was different. Where Diana had been warm, Camilla was calculating. Where Diana had been spontaneous, Camilla was rehearsed. James had observed her for years now, watching as she played the role of devoted companion while photographers captured every carefully staged moment. To him, she represented everything artificial about modern royalty, a stark contrast to the authentic nobility he had sworn to protect. The morning briefing in the guardhouse was tense. Captain Reynolds, a man James had served under for 15 years, looked uncomfortable as he read from the official protocol sheet. The upcoming ceremony would be Camilla's first major public appearance as Queen Consort, and every detail had to be perfect. Dignitaries from across the Commonwealth would be watching, and any mistake would reflect poorly on the entire institution. "Remember, gentlemen," Captain Reynolds said, his voice carrying the weight of tradition, "today we represent centuries of British excellence. The eyes of the world will be upon us." His gaze lingered on James for a moment longer than necessary. Reynolds knew his sergeant better than most, understood the conflict brewing beneath the perfectly pressed uniform. As the guards took their positions, James felt the familiar weight of his bearskin hat and the comfort of his rifle against his shoulder. These physical anchors had grounded him through countless ceremonies, but today they felt heavier, as if the very air around him had thickened with expectation and dread. The first guests began arriving in their polished carriages, stepping out onto the red carpet that had been rolled across the courtyard. James watched from his position, noting the careful smiles and practiced waves, the way each person performed their role in this grand theater of monarchy. Everything was choreographed, everything calculated to project an image of stability and continuity. But James knew the truth that lay beneath the pageantry. He had seen the private moments, witnessed the arguments behind closed doors, observed the careful management of public opinion. The monarchy he served was not the same institution his grandfather had protected. It had become something else, something that prioritized image over substance, politics over principle. When Camilla's car pulled into the courtyard, James felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. She emerged with practiced elegance, her smile perfectly calibrated for the cameras. Every gesture was smooth, every movement designed to project queenly dignity. Yet to James, it all felt like an elaborate performance. A skilled actress playing a role she had studied but never truly inhabited. The ceremony began with the traditional fanfare, trumpets announcing the arrival of the new queen consort. James stood motionless in his assigned position, but his mind raced with memories of similar ceremonies when Queen Elizabeth had been the center of attention. There had been something different then, a genuine reverence that filled the air like incense. Today felt hollow by comparison, as if everyone was going through the motions of respect without feeling its substance. As Camilla moved through the formal presentations, accepting congratulations and well wishes from the assembled dignitaries, James observed her interaction with each guest. She was competent, he had to admit, hitting all the right notes and saying all the proper words. But competence wasn't the same as legitimacy in his eyes. Anyone could learn the steps of a dance. That didn't make them a dancer. The pivotal moment approached as the ceremony moved into its final phase. According to the established protocol, all guards were expected to participate in a traditional demonstration of loyalty. It was a symbolic gesture that had been performed for centuries, a physical manifestation of the bond between the crown and its protectors. James had participated in this ritual countless times, but never with such reluctance weighing down his limbs. Captain Reynolds caught his eye from across the courtyard, a subtle reminder of duty and expectation. James could see the concern in his commander's face, the recognition that something was amiss with his most reliable sergeant. Reynolds had been a mentor to James, guiding him through promotions and personal crises, always emphasizing the importance of putting duty before personal feelings. The crowd fell silent as the moment arrived. James could feel hundreds of eyes upon him, sensed the weight of history pressing down like a physical force. In his mind, he heard his father's voice reciting the guard's oath, the solemn promise to protect and serve with honor above self. But whose honor was he protecting now? The institution he loved, or the woman who had transformed it into something unrecognizable? Camilla's gaze swept across the assembled guards, her expression serene and confident. She expected their loyalty as her due, anticipated their compliance as a foregone conclusion. In that moment, James saw not a queen deserving of respect, but a reminder of everything that had been lost, everything that had been compromised in the name of political convenience. The command came, clear and unmistakable, echoing across the silent courtyard with the force of tradition behind it. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before an ancient altar. James Mitchell stood frozen as the command reached his ears, his 23 years of military conditioning warring against something deeper and more primal rising from within his chest. Around him, his fellow guardsmen began the familiar motion, their movements synchronized like clockwork, each man playing his part in a ceremony older than memory. But James could not move. His boots remained firmly planted on the cobblestones as if they had grown roots, his body refusing to obey the command that his mind knew by heart. The bearskin hat that had felt so familiar moments before now seemed to press down upon his skull like a crown of thorns, each second of hesitation adding weight to the crushing silence that surrounded him. Captain Reynolds saw it first. From his position near the palace steps, the captain's trained eye immediately identified the break in formation, the single figure standing upright among his kneeling comrades like a defiant tree in a field of bent wheat. Reynolds felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized the unmistakable profile of his most trusted sergeant, the man he had personally recommended for promotion just 6 months earlier. The crowd began to notice. Whispers rippled through the assembled dignitaries like wind through autumn leaves. Heads turning and fingers pointing as the realization spread that something unprecedented was happening. Camera operators adjusted their focus, capturing the moment when centuries of protocol cracked like ice under sudden pressure. Camilla herself seemed initially unaware of the disruption. She continued with her prepared remarks, her voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority. But as the murmur of the crowd grew louder and the tension became palpable, she glanced toward the source of the disturbance. When her eyes found James standing defiantly among his kneeling brothers, her composed expression flickered for just an instant, revealing a flash of something raw beneath the queenly mask. James felt the weight of every gaze upon him, but none more intensely than Camilla's. In that brief moment when their eyes met across the courtyard, he saw recognition pass between them. She knew exactly who he was, just as he knew exactly what his defiance represented. This wasn't simply a breach of protocol, it was a direct challenge to her legitimacy, a public declaration that at least one guardian of royal tradition refused to accept her authority. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could feel sweat beating beneath his heavy uniform despite the cool morning air. Every instinct screamed at him to kneel, to save himself and everyone else from the embarrassment and consequences of this moment. But something stronger held him upright, something that connected him to his grandfather's stories of serving a real queen, to his father's tales of protecting genuine nobility. Behind him, James could sense the confusion and concern of his fellow guardsmen. These men were his brothers in arms, soldiers who had stood with him through countless ceremonies and celebrations. He knew that his actions were putting them in an impossible position, forcing them to choose between loyalty to their comrade and obedience to their sworn duty. The weight of that knowledge pressed upon his shoulders, but still he could not make himself kneel. Captain Reynolds made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Breaking from his position, he strode across the courtyard with quick, measured steps that spoke of barely contained urgency. His face was a mask of military discipline, but James could read the storm brewing beneath his commander's calm exterior. Reynolds had served the crown for 30 years, had never seen anything like this, had never imagined that one of his own men would create such a crisis. "Sergeant Mitchell," Reynolds said quietly as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of rank and the desperation of a man trying to prevent a catastrophe. "You will assume the proper position immediately." The words were spoken softly enough that only James could hear them, but they carried the full weight of military law and royal protocol. James turned his head slightly to meet his captain's gaze, and Reynolds saw something in his sergeant's eyes that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't defiance for its own sake, nor was it simple insubordination. Instead, Reynolds saw the look of a man who had reached the absolute limit of what his conscience could bear, a soldier whose loyalty to an ideal had finally overcome his loyalty to orders. "I cannot, sir," James replied, his voice steady despite the tremor running through his entire body. "I will not kneel before her." The words were spoken with quiet dignity, but they exploded across the courtyard like artillery shells. Several dignitaries gasped audibly, and even some of the kneeling guardsmen shifted uncomfortably at hearing such open rebellion spoken aloud. Camilla's reaction was swift and decisive. Her years of navigating royal scandals and public relations crises had taught her that such moments required immediate action. She could not allow this challenge to her authority to stand unchallenged, could not permit a single guardsman's defiance to undermine the carefully constructed image of her legitimacy. Her voice cut through the morning air with regal authority that brooked no disagreement. "Guards will maintain proper protocol," she announced, her words clearly intended for James, but spoken loudly enough for every person in the courtyard to hear. All guardsmen will demonstrate appropriate respect for the crown." The emphasis on all was unmistakable, a direct command that left no room for interpretation or excuse. But James remained standing. If anything, Camilla's direct intervention seemed to strengthen his resolve. He had spent years watching her manipulate situations to her advantage, had witnessed her calculated transformation from royal mistress to queen consort. Now, faced with her direct command, all of his suppressed resentment and principled opposition crystallized into absolute refusal. The standoff stretched beyond comfort, beyond protocol, beyond anything anyone in attendance had ever witnessed. Royal ceremonies were choreographed down to the second, every participant knowing exactly when to speak, when to move, when to breathe. This moment of unscripted confrontation shattered that careful order like a stone through stained glass. Media representatives in the designated press area worked frantically to capture every angle of the unprecedented scene. Some recognized immediately that they were witnessing history, a moment that would be analyzed and debated for generations. Others struggled to understand exactly what was happening, why a single soldier's refusal to kneel had transformed a routine ceremony into a constitutional crisis. James felt strangely calm as the weight of his decision settled fully upon him. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return, had chosen principle over pragmatism in a way that would define the rest of his life. The career he had built over 2 decades was crumbling around him with each passing second, but for the first time in months, he felt truly authentic to himself and his values. Around him, the ceremony had effectively ground to a halt. No one seemed quite sure how to proceed, how to restore order to a situation that had no precedent in modern royal history. Camilla stood frozen in place, her queenly composure beginning to crack under the strain of public humiliation. Captain Reynolds looked between his sergeant and his sovereign, trapped between competing loyalties and impossible choices. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting new shadows across the courtyard where tradition and rebellion faced each other in silent combat. James Mitchell, grandson of guardsmen and son of guardsmen, stood alone against the weight of history and protocol, his refusal to kneel becoming a symbol of something larger than himself, something that would echo far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across centuries, connecting this moment to every instance of conscience confronting authority throughout British history. James Mitchell stood as still as the ancient stones beneath his feet, but inside his mind raced with the magnitude of what he had unleashed. This was no longer simply about kneeling or standing. It had become a public referendum on legitimacy, loyalty, and the very meaning of honor in modern Britain. Captain Reynolds made a choice that would define both their futures. Instead of ordering James's immediate arrest, he stepped closer to his sergeant, positioning himself slightly between James and the increasingly agitated crowd. "Sergeant," he whispered urgently, "think about your family, your pension, your future. Is this worth throwing everything away?" The words carried genuine concern beneath their military authority. But James had already considered these consequences during the endless nights of doubt that had led to this moment. "Sir, my grandfather served Queen Victoria. My father served Elizabeth II. They served queens who earned their respect through character, not politics. I cannot dishonor their memory by kneeling before someone who represents everything they fought against." His voice remained steady, but tears gathered at the corners of his eyes as he spoke of the family legacy he was about to destroy. The crowd's murmur had grown into a low roar of confusion and debate. Some spectators voiced their shock at James's insubordination, while others whispered their secret admiration for his courage. The division in the courtyard reflected the deeper divisions within British society itself, the unresolved questions about tradition, change, and what the monarchy should represent in the 21st century. Camilla, recognizing that every second of inaction weakened her position, made a decision that revealed the steel beneath her carefully cultivated image. She stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard as she addressed James directly. "Sergeant Mitchell, your service to the Crown has been noted and appreciated. However, the Crown requires obedience from all its servants. You will kneel now, or you will face the consequences of your defiance." The use of his name sent a chill through the assembled crowd. It transformed what might have been dismissed as a moment of confusion into a personal confrontation between the Queen Consort and a specific individual. James felt the full weight of royal authority pressing down upon him, but also recognized that Camilla's public challenge had trapped them both in a confrontation that could only end one way. "Your Majesty," James replied, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtyard, "I have served the Crown faithfully for 23 years. I have protected it, honored it, and sacrificed for it. But I serve the Crown as an institution, not any individual who claims to wear it. And my conscience tells me that kneeling before you would dishonor everything that Crown represents." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. In front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras, a common soldier had publicly questioned her right to royal respect. Her face flushed red beneath her carefully applied makeup, and for a moment, the careful mask of queenly composure slipped entirely, revealing the angry woman beneath. "Remove him!" she commanded, her voice sharp with barely controlled fury. "Remove him immediately!" The order echoed across the courtyard with all the authority she could muster, but it also revealed her desperation to end this humiliating confrontation. Captain Reynolds hesitated. Military protocol demanded immediate compliance with royal commands. But something in the way Camilla delivered the order troubled him deeply. He had served long enough to recognize the difference between legitimate authority and petulant rage, and this moment felt more like the latter. Still, his duty was clear, even if his conscience was conflicted. "Sergeant Mitchell," Reynolds said formally, "you are relieved of duty and will report for disciplinary action." But as he spoke the words, he placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder, a gesture of respect that spoke volumes about his true feelings. James nodded slowly, accepting his fate with dignity that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. He began the long walk across the courtyard toward the guardhouse, each step measured and deliberate. He would not give his critics the satisfaction of seeing him skulk away in shame or hurry away in fear. As he walked, something unexpected happened. One of the kneeling guardsmen, a young soldier named Private Harrison, whom James had mentored, slowly rose to his feet. Then another guardsman stood, and another, until nearly half the formation was upright again, their silent solidarity with their sergeant creating a new crisis within the original crisis. The sight of multiple guards refusing to maintain the required position sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. What had begun as one man's act of conscience had apparently inspired others to question their own participation in what they now saw as an illegitimate display of authority. The carefully orchestrated ceremony was collapsing into something unprecedented and uncontrollable. Camilla stared in horror as her moment of triumph transformed into a public relations nightmare. The image of multiple guards refusing her implicit command would dominate news coverage for weeks, undermining every effort to establish her authority and legitimacy. Her hands shook with barely controlled rage as she watched her carefully planned ceremony dissolving into chaos. Captain Reynolds found himself facing an impossible situation. He could not arrest half his command, could not explain away this level of coordinated defiance, could not restore order to something that had fundamentally broken. The institution he had served faithfully for 3 decades was fragmenting before his eyes, and he was powerless to prevent it. James reached the edge of the courtyard and turned for one final look at the scene behind him. What he saw filled him with both pride and sorrow, his fellow guardsmen standing in quiet solidarity, the crowd buzzing with excited conversation, and Camilla isolated in her fury while the ceremony she had commanded fell apart around her. He had achieved what he set out to do, but the cost to everyone involved would be enormous. The media coverage that followed would be merciless and extensive. Every major news outlet led with the story of the guards who refused to kneel, analyzing every angle and implication of their defiance. James Mitchell became an overnight symbol of principled resistance, praised by some as a hero and condemned by others as a traitor. The British public found itself engaged in the most serious discussion about the monarchy's legitimacy since the abdication crisis of 1936. Within hours, James received his formal discharge from the Guards, along with the loss of his pension and benefits, but he also received thousands of letters of support from ordinary citizens who saw his stand as representing their own feelings about the monarchy's direction. Job offers poured in from private security firms and veterans organizations who wanted to employ someone willing to sacrifice everything for his principles. Camilla's position, meanwhile, became increasingly precarious as polls showed declining support for her role as queen consort. The image of guards refusing to show her proper respect had crystallized public doubts about her legitimacy in a way that no amount of positive publicity could overcome. King Charles found himself forced to address the crisis, ultimately agreeing to modifications in protocol that acknowledged the unique sensitivities surrounding his wife's position. Years later, James would look back on that moment in the courtyard as both the end of one life and the beginning of another. He had lost his career but found his conscience, had sacrificed his security but gained his integrity. The red uniform that had defined him for over 2 decades was gone, but the principles that uniform was meant to represent lived on in his defiant stand against illegitimate authority. The ceremony that was meant to establish Camilla's authority had instead become a testament to the power of individual conscience over institutional pressure. In a single moment of refusal, James Mitchell had reminded the world that true loyalty serves principles rather than personalities, and that sometimes the greatest service one can render to an institution is to refuse to participate in its corruption. The echoes of that morning would continue to resonate through British society long after the last news story had been filed and the last interview had been given. In classrooms and pubs, in Parliament and palaces, people would debate the meaning of James Mitchell's stand, asking themselves what they might have done in his place and whether courage like his still had a place in modern Britain. The answer, written in the faces of the guardsmen who stood with him and the citizens who supported him afterward, was that some principles are worth any sacrifice, and that true honor sometimes requires the courage to stand alone against the world.